I was a stubborn and precocious teen. At age 15, I had a lot of friends, but I was a bit of a loner, and I enjoyed long walks in nature. Very long walks, sometimes at 10 miles plus. Since I couldn't drive yet, I would often just take off from my house and walk on back roads all day long. This was before smartphones, and I was a 100-pound, very tiny girl, and my parents probably shouldn't have allowed it. But they have always been very relaxed in their parenting. But like I said, I was stubborn. I also had an unhealthy attitude and invulnerability and naivety. On these walks, people would often pull over and ask me if I needed a ride. The vast majority were men. I never said yes. Usually, I would respond politely with, "No thank you, I'm on a walk," and they would leave me alone. Maybe after an "Are you sure?" and a concerned look at most. This happened literally hundreds of times without incident. However, there was one time that I got a bit lost while walking. Not severely lost, as I could easily backtrack the 5 or 6 miles home. But I had taken a wrong turn and wandered into a very rural area that I had not expected to be in. Whatever, it was a nice day, so I kept walking. A guy in his early 30s in a bit of a junky car passed by and asked if I needed a ride, as per usual. I politely declined and he drove on. I got creepy vibes, but I didn't think much of it. And then 10 minutes later, he pulled up behind me again. This was a rural road, and he must have driven in a very large loop to come up behind me again, miles out of the way. He started slowly, driving alongside me while I walked and asked personal questions. My name, my age, where I lived. I didn't tell the truth. He also repeatedly tried to get me to get into his car. I was very uncomfortable and I just wanted him to go away, but I wasn't afraid to be rude. However, I was not getting in his car. After an excruciating 5 minutes or so of this, another car came and he was forced to drive off again. I was more annoyed than scared at this point. That good old invulnerable attitude. And then like clockwork, 10 minutes later, to my horror, I see the car again. This time, he doesn't drive alongside me, but he parks in a pullout a few feet ahead. I don't know what came over me, but instead of panic, my brain just shut down and I became entirely disassociative. I decided to just ignore him. I walked by the car calmly, continuing my walk. I tried not to look at him, but I stole a glance. He was pointing something at me. It was a gun. And before I had time to react or even think, a motorcycle pulled up behind us and parked. My stalker seemed extremely panicked by this and peeled out as quickly as possible. I must have looked freaked out because the motorcyclist, who looked like a dad type, was concerned. He asked me if I was okay and if I needed a ride. I gave my usual, "No thank you, I'm on a walk," and he drove off. I was feeling pretty distrusting at that point, and aside from that, I didn't want to climb on a motorcycle with anyone, even though he had saved me from something potentially very bad. Looking back, I owe quite a lot to him. I'm not sure what compelled him to stop, but thank goodness that he did. I then ran the long distance back home, looking over my shoulder the entire way. I never saw the man again. I didn't tell my parents because I was afraid of them restricting my freedom. I still took my long walks, but not again in that area, until a popular nature reserve was opened there years later. To start, let me explain myself. I'm 5'7", 113 pounds, and I was 16 at the time of the encounter. I'm a multi-sport athlete. Track, handball, volleyball, basketball, and hockey. And I have insomnia. This all happened around 2 a.m. on August 10th of 2019. I had been over to my best friend's place because she had just returned home from a vacation, and she had birthday presents for me. Hoodies and gummies if you're curious. I had spent almost an hour there already, and wanted to head back home soon because, honestly, my town is scary at night. And drug dealers and a lot of really bad people. You know the deal. So I waved goodbye to my best friend and started walking down her street. I guess a party had just let up because behind me at the end of the road, about 20 or 30 yards from where I was standing, there were a couple of men walking across the crosswalk. They were both pretty tall, I'm guessing between 5'11 and 6'3". The two seemed harmless at first when I looked in their direction, but soon they came to a stop. They were both looking at me. At this point I felt uncomfortable, so I just kept walking, and that's when I overheard what one of them had said. "Hey, that's a girl." At this, I whipped my head around. They were starting to walk in my direction now, and one of the two men had moved over towards the sidewalk where there was no light. I knew at this point that something wasn't right, and I began to pick up my pace. They were still getting closer. I didn't know where the second guy was, but when I looked back, the first guy was still following me down the middle of the road. I think that they were planning to cut me off and try to trap me between the two of them. The minute I was about 13 yards from the T intersection, I started to run, and that's when the yelling had started. Oh great, now she's running. I hooked a sharp right and then a left. I could still hear them behind me, and at this point all I knew was that I could not stop moving. I had to lose them somehow. I was coming up to an apartment building with a small parking lot behind it. There were no lights. I made the split-second decision to veer off into the parking lot, and I squeezed myself under one of the cars. I don't know how long that I waited there. It could have been a minute, but it felt like a lifetime. I watched the two men run past. They didn't bother to check under the cars, which was definitely in my favor. The minute that I felt that I was safe, I backtracked and took a different route back to my home. I was too scared to take the main way, in the fear that I would have bumped into them. I know what I'm about to say is stupid, but I didn't go to the police. I wouldn't have been able to give a proper description of the men, because I hadn't seen their faces. If there is anything I learned from my experience, it's that no matter who you are, you need to be extremely careful. You can think that the part of town or city that you live in is safe, but that really isn't the case. There is no protective barrier to keep out people with bad intentions. Please, whatever you do, watch your surroundings as if your life depends on it. If I had been listening to my music and not paying attention, I hate to think what could have happened to me. I hope that no one else has to experience the fear that I did. It was almost like prey being chased by predators. Back in 2015, when I was in my second semester of college as a freshman, I had a habit of pacing around to keep my thoughts coming. I had had this habit since childhood, and it often seemed that I couldn't stay focused on anything that required creative thought without it. Considering my intended major required literature and creative writing courses, it was something that I found myself doing constantly, especially when I was trying to think up ideas for essays and narratives assigned in class. To be clear, my pacing just isn't walking. It needs to be done along a predictable short route, so I can mentally clock out of reality and focus solely on my thoughts while I run on autopilot. I often put in headphones to prevent distractions that take me back into reality, because if that happens in mid-thought pattern, I'll lose at least half of the ideas that I was exploring. It's weird, I know, but I wanted to clarify this now because I've had people ask me why I just don't go for a long walk around the neighborhood, instead of walking around in circles in my backyard like I normally do. It was getting late one evening, and I had a lengthy essay due the day after next. I had a good portion of it done already, but I still had a bit to go. My roommate had come back to the dorm, and considering the time it was, perfectly understandable that she wanted to sleep. She generally didn't mind my pacing, but preferred that I didn't do it when she was trying to rest. It's also understandable. And with her turning the lights off in the room, it would be a little difficult for me anyway. I still wanted to keep going on this assignment though, so I decided to find somewhere else on campus outside the room to pace, and figured I would note down ideas in an app on my phone as needed for later. There was nowhere in the dorm complex that was suitable, so I started walking around. The university was well known for its large campus, so I figured I would find a good place eventually. I walked for a bit until I found myself at one of the more historic buildings, which had a nice courtyard in front of it. Part of this courtyard included wide pedestrian paths that met in the center, as a nice roundabout with a fountain in the middle. A little further from that was another small roundabout with a grass island in the center. Circular paths like that are ideal for my pacing, because I don't have to stop and turn around repeatedly, and I ended up choosing to walk around the one with the grass island, so I wouldn't disturb anyone who wanted to hang out by the fountain. Some people are a bit unnerved by my pacing, so I worried it might freak out a stranger who saw me on a late-night walk. There was the occasional passerby, but for the most part, the place was empty at this time of night. I figured I could go in circles for a bit without disturbing anyone. I put in my headphones. Yes, both of them, and yes, I'm aware that was a poor decision, given these circumstances, but I was exhausted, and I just wanted to get the brainstorming session over with so I could go to sleep. I started to walk in circles with my music playing as my mind drifted. I don't know how long I was pacing before the encounter, but it wasn't long. As I was rounding once more, I was met by headlights from a car driving slowly up the path to this roundabout. I was a little confused by this, as I was sure the path was meant for pedestrian traffic only. But since it was deserted save for me, I just assumed that the driver needed an easy way to turn around, and didn't think it was a big deal since the risk of accidentally hitting someone was next to zero. The vehicle passed me while I moved closer to the center to keep me from being in the way, and I kept my eyes on it while I walked. I expected the car to just go around and back down the path that it came from, since that was the only path on the roundabout that led back to the street. But instead, it came to a stop on the side of the roundabout opposite the street. While I initially started to assume then that they needed to look at their GPS or make a phone call before continuing, there was no denying the uneasy feeling I got about the situation. Instead of continuing my round route, which would have taken me right alongside the vehicle, I decided to take one of the paths toward the building and just wait for them to move on. While I walked, I noticed an empty parking lot on the other side of the building. The path didn't go there, but it was easy to walk over the grass patch dividing the two areas. I started to pace in the lot for a bit, and I quickly forgot about returning to the roundabout, as I got lost in my thoughts again. I was pulled back into reality by the shine of semi-distant headlights. It was the same car from before, or at least it looked eerily similar. Luckily, I was facing the entrance to the lot as it turned in, and said entrance was a decent distance from me. I started to hear quiet alarm bells in the back of my mind, even as my rational side tried to assume that it must be a different car, and just an odd coincidence. And perhaps I was just paranoid. Regardless of the mental attempt to explain it away, I felt it was better safe than sorry. I ended up walking around the other side of the building to get back to the little roundabout that I was at before. I took a breath and I calmed my nerves a little with some half-hearted reassurances before walking on the roundabout again. This time, I didn't turn my music back on, but I kept my headphones in. They weren't noise canceling at all, so I could hear decently through them when the music was paused. I wanted to go back to brainstorming, but felt somewhat anxious and panicky at the thought of it. So I kept pacing like I had been, this time focused on the very much aware of what was going on around me. I thought that maybe once 10 or 15 minutes had gone by without incident, I'd be able to calm down and get the last of this done. Barely 5 minutes had passed when I heard the obvious sound of rubber tires coming up the path again. This time when I looked, I was certain it was the same car and that it had followed me back here from the parking lot. I didn't know what the driver wanted with me. They never honked, rolled down windows, or anything to try and get my attention. But I realized at that point that as a 19-year-old girl alone at night in a more secluded area of campus, I had been extremely lucky so far. And that luck wouldn't last forever. This time, I speed-walked through the grass. There's a pedestrian-only, arch-like bridge that goes over a busy major street that runs through campus. Most of the dorms like mine are on one side of the bridge, while lecture halls and class buildings are on the other. And while I normally hated this bridge because of how steep it was closer than the nearest street crossing right then. I didn't have a wait time to cross it, and there was no chance of a vehicle following me up. I felt much more at ease from the top of it, and from there I saw the car drive off, seemingly calling it a night. I walked back to my dorm, and by the time I reached my door, the adrenaline had worn off and I was exhausted. I went in quietly to not wake my roommate, laid in bed without even changing into pajamas, and I fell asleep. I never contacted campus police about the matter or anything, because I didn't have any helpful information, other than a four-door car that could have been black or dark blue for all I know, and it didn't seem like I'd be believed anyway. I never saw the vehicle again or heard anything that related to it in any way, so over time, it slipped my mind altogether. I still don't know what the driver had planned, or why they didn't just get out of the car and come after me on foot at any point. Maybe it was the first time that they were trying this, and they were nervous about making a scene or getting caught. Maybe it was just some college assholes messing with me, because they thought it was fun to scare people like that. Whatever it was, I'm glad I didn't have to find out the hard way, and I never paced in public areas after dark on that campus again. So, this happened to me about 8 years ago. I used to work at a tobacconist when I was 18. My first job after graduating high school, but not my first job in retail. The staff there were hired as casual employees but on full-time hours. I got the job at the time because I was young and that meant I was cheap labor. But the pay was pretty decent and I was job hunting, and took the first job I was offered so I could move out of home. When I first started there were 4 of us employed. 2 of us would be on shift at a time with a 1-hour handover. The open hours were from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. I was happy doing the closing shifts because I wasn't a morning person. A couple of months into my employment, the company decided to change their business hours during weekdays from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., with one 9 p.m. on late-night shopping. This upped my hours so more money, and of course, I was put on a couple closing shifts a night, with rotation between me and another worker, but only one person would stay at the shop from 6 p.m. I was a little bit iffy about this because I lived in a sketchy suburb in a sketchy town. The later that it got in the night, the more the undesirables were abundant. Our laws prohibit us from carrying protection, and at the time, I didn't drive, so I relied on buses or taxis as transport. Taxis weren't reliable here. You would call one and they wouldn't chill or make you wait an hour, so I stuck with buses because I knew they would arrive. Uber wasn't an option then. There was a transit bus stop 1 minute away from my work, one scheduled to leave about 5 minutes before our closing time. I tried to negotiate to my boss to close a little early, but he wasn't open to the idea. "You can catch a cab," he offered. Yeah, I could, but that's not guaranteed. I usually got them on my 9 p.m. shift, so my routine was to stay until closing and wait 30 to 40 minutes for the next bus. As practice, I would wait in the closed store until 5 minutes before bus arrived, and then I would walk in and wait by the stop. So, one night, I shut shop, hung out a bit inside with the lights on so the shopping center security knows that I'm still there, and I head out to the bus stop at 8:30 p.m. I was relieved to see that there were about 6 other people waiting at the stop. As I'm standing there waiting for the bus, a guy in his 30s or 40s who was visibly intoxicated and on other stuff, who knows what, approaches me. Where you headed? Home. Can I come home with you? I shake my head no. He then takes a step closer, and he is so close that I could smell and feel his breath on my face. Automatically, I step back so I'm not out of my comfort zone and try to walk closer to other people. A regular customer that I liked could see me and tried to start up a conversation to get me out of talking to this creep, but the creep got real pissed at this. He got intimidating and told me to look at him when he's talking to me. He was smiling in a way that made me feel sick, and my whole body suddenly rushed with adrenaline. I tried to say that I'm not talking to you, but he just kept trying to get closer to me and insisted that we're going home together. Thankfully, the buses finally started to arrive, and I started feeling relieved, hoping this guy would get on one before me. Nope. He lingers and asks what bus I'm getting on. There was no way that I was going to tell him what bus I was getting on. If it was the same one as me, I was going to catch a different one. Well, he told me that he's getting on mine, and my heart sank. My bus was the last in line, so everyone was piling onto theirs, and I was about to be left alone with this guy, and I knew that he would follow me. If I tried to call the cops on the bus, would he become aggressive? I was already in. How the heck do I get out of this mode? Just as my bus pulls up and opens the doors, the transit security pulls up behind and rushes out of the car yelling at the creep. We told you to move on from here. The creep starts cussing and yelling, but he walks away. The security guys ask if I'm alright, and I just nod and jump on the bus before it pulls away. I'm so grateful they arrived when they did, and I dread to think what could have happened if this man did follow me home.